the Time to Wonder podcast, a behind-the-scenes peek into the world of museums for kids of all ages everywhere. Hi, I'm Ava.
Hi, I'm Leslie.
And I'm Sue.
And this is a podcast where kids ask questions about museums.
And we find the answers.
In this program, we're going to be talking about skeletons and how they are prepared for museum exhibits. While there is no graphic content, it still may be disturbing to some children. The big question today is, how do museums put skeletons together?
Today's guests are Mike deRoos and Michi Maine. They are skeleton articulators. They put together the skeletons of marine mammals like killer whales and dolphins in a way that makes them look like they're swimming or diving down to the bottom of the sea.
Their company, Cetacea Contracting, is hired by museums who want to display the skeletons of marine mammals. What they do is not very common, so they get asked by museums around the world to articulate skeletons for them.
If you've ever been in Telegraph Cove on Vancouver Island, you can see several examples of skeletons Mike and Michi have worked with. Something listeners should know is that Mike and Michi don't just get handed skeletons. They work with animals that have been killed or have died a natural death. So they still have flesh, muscles, and ligaments and skin. They have to strip the bones down to the skeleton. Welcome, you guys. We're excited to learn all about skeletons and what you do with your work.
Where do you find the animals?
That's a great question. Yeah, so all of the animals that we work on have died out in the oceans for some reason, and we find them after they're dead. Sometimes they die of natural causes like old age or some disease. But quite often, and sadly, they actually die because of humans. Either you might be entangled in a fishing net, or they might get hit by a ship, and then we'll find them after they've died from that.
So when a marine mammal is found stranded, there's a response hotline that people can call and report to. And then if it's determined that the animal can't be rescued or dies, then we'll often work with the response team and try to figure out what happened and why the animal might have died. And then if a museum or university would like to keep the bones for research purposes or for display, then they'll hire us to do that part of the job.
How old are they?
I'm curious to know if you mean like how old are the whales that when they die, or how old are the bones when we find them? Or there's sort of two questions there.
Well, if you're curious about how old the animal is when they die, so whales are just like us and they'll die at all different times of their lives. So it really depends on what's happened to the animal. But many whales can live as long as humans, or some even longer. We've had specimens that we suspect were maybe even over 100 years old.
But I'm also curious about the bone element of the question.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes. So like when we see bones in museums, we're often curious about how old they are, because some bones can be really, really old, like dinosaur bones. And those would be like hundreds of millions of years old. Whereas whales are actually, swimming around in our oceans right now. And so the bones that we work with from these animals are really not very old. They could be, just found yesterday, or maybe some of them have been maybe found about 100 years ago. And that's about as old as the animals that we work on have lived. So they're all really like present day animals that are out there swimming around our oceans. And sometimes we find them when they're they've been dead for a week, and sometimes we find them when they've been dead for a few months, and other times a museum collected them maybe 100 years ago, and then we go and just put them together. So less than 100 years generally.
How do you move them?
That's a super good question. So it really depends on how big the animal is that we're talking about. So if we are working with a little sea otter, then it just doesn't take very much effort to move it, and we can just do that by ourselves. But most of the whales we work on are actually much, much bigger than that. And so when we find them on the shore, there's no way that we would be able to actually move them ourselves. So we begin the process of taking them apart, and then often we'll call all our friends to come help us, or be lucky enough to be able to work with locals in the area to move bones. And sometimes if we're talking like blue whale scale, we'll have to even hire machines to come and help us.
Oh, wow. That's so cool.
How happy are your friends to come and help you do that?
So the thing is, everybody wants to come out once, but we very rarely get people returning.
How do you clean the bones?
Well, that's a really tricky job because when we find them, of course, they're inside the body of a whale. And so the very first thing we need to do is actually to take the whole whale apart and take the bones out from inside the body. And then we use bugs and microbes and things like that to clean all of the soft, fleshy stuff off of the bones.
And we're really lucky because we live on Salt Spring Island, and lots of people here love horses. And horse poop is actually one of the best cleaners, natural cleaners for getting flesh off of bones, we found. So we usually call on people we know who have horses. We collect a whole pile of manure and we make a big burial for the bones.
Horse poop is the greatest thing to clean bones.
Because it also decomposes so quickly that it generates tons of heat. And that really is helpful with whales because whale bones are full of oil. And so that heat helps the oil actually liquefy and drain out of the bones.
Are they smelly?
Well, yes. For a short answer. Usually when we find a whale, it's not super fresh. And so you can imagine if it's been sitting there for a little while, the body starts to decompose a little bit and it doesn't smell very nice. They're pretty big and pretty oily. And that's one of the hardest parts of our job actually is to go out and work on a whale like that, because I come home and like nobody wants to even get close to me. I usually can't smell it anymore. I have a horrible...
The funny thing about our sense of smell, right, is that it gets overwhelmed over time. So while you're working on something so smelly and disgusting, you actually stop noticing how bad it smells as you're working on it because you get used to it. And so it's actually a bit of a danger because then you leave the site and you come home and you can't smell how bad you smell, but everybody else around you can.
Yeah. You go away for a little while and, you clean yourself and have a good shower and scrub your hands really well. And you go away and then you come back to like the clothes you were wearing when you cut the whale up and you're like, oh, okay, these clothes only have one purpose from now on. And that's for taking whales apart. And they go in a garbage bag and they never come out other than for whale necropsies.
We actually have a whole protocol around what you're allowed to touch and what you're allowed to wear when we're working with skeletons that are stinky so that we can avoid cross-contamination and bringing the smell into people's cars and onto their good clothes and such.
Mm-hmm.
How do you keep the bones from breaking?
Well, bones are really cool because they're designed by nature to be strong. And so the bones inside an animal allow it to move because the muscles push and pull and use them as like levers and stuff like that. So once we get all the bones clean and the flesh off, we actually don't have to do that much to them to keep them from breaking. You just have to be a little bit careful about how you handle them. You don't want to drop them from a really high height. But if you're careful and you keep them clean and dry, then they'll last for a really long time without breaking.
How do you know where the bones go?
This is a good question.
That's a hard one.
So skeletons are like, imagine the world's hugest, funnest puzzle. And if you've ever done a big, 1,000-piece puzzle, you'll notice that as you do it, you start to recognize shapes more and notice color patterns. Well, working on a skeleton is really similar, hey, Mike?
Yeah. And so when you're looking at the clues for your puzzle and you put two bones together, you'll all of a sudden notice those shapes match. And nature has designed the skeleton perfectly so that it works together, all the different pieces. And so
when you have any given bone in a skeleton, there's only one way that it can actually fit in the skeleton. And once you figure that out and put it in its place, it makes tons of sense.
that's the long answer. The shorter one is we did study it in university and we looked at all sorts of books and stuff.
And we've looked at hundreds and hundreds of bones. So.
But the best way is just to really look carefully at the animal and how the skeleton works, and it will tell you if you do that.
What happens if some bones are missing?
Oh, quite often the skeletons that we work on have missing bones. It's really hard to find every single bone in a 50-foot whale on the beach. And so sometimes little tiny bits and pieces go missing, or some are broken off. And we used to really sort of tediously sculpt missing ones or mold and cast. And now we almost always use a 3D printer to replicate the missing pieces. Yeah, it works so well. We can actually take bones from a different animal and scan them and then print them out for the missing skeleton and just make them a perfect match for the part that's gone missing.
That's crazy. That's so awesome.
How do you put the skeleton together?
Oh, that's probably the funnest part of our job. And I basically sort of just figured it out as I went along. And we use lots of metal bits and pieces and welding and stuff like that. The whole whale is, depending on what type of whale it is pretty big. So we need strong structures to hold these bones up in the air. And we find that metal is usually the best type of material to work with. We use a little bit of glue from time to time, but mostly metal bits to hold the bones together.
How long does it take to put a skeleton together?
Well, that really depends on the size of the skeleton that we're working on. So a little sea otter might take us about 3 or 4 weeks if we're being really careful. But a blue whale could take us a year or two.
Wow.
With a lot of planning beforehand.
Wow, that's a long time.
So when
Yeah.
you get a job like a blue whale, if little jobs come up like doing a littler animal, will you do those and then go back to the blue whale? Or is it just like once you have a project, you just work on that continuously?
It really depends. Often a whale or a project like a blue whale will actually take us to a different place. So we did a blue whale in 2020 in Australia. So we just worked on that one solidly while we were there. But that's a really good question. Sometimes with our smaller projects, we will, something will come up and we'll end up working on a couple of skeletons at the same time, or we'll be cleaning a skeleton while we're putting another one together.
Yeah, we often have a few skeletons in our closet, or in our case, in our attic. And so these are skeletons that have been cleaned and they're waiting sort of in line to be put together. Or we'll have a manure compost heap in the backyard with a skeleton in it that's being cleaned at the same time that we're putting a different one together in our workshop.
Wow.
You must have a pretty big workshop.
It's
you might
smaller
be surprised.
than you imagine.
Often when we're working on a project, we never see it together until we install it in the museum. In the end, we just see the parts that we put together in sort of different components.
When you give museums your skeleton stuff, if say it's a big blue whale or something, and they ask you for 3 of them or something, what would be your reaction?
Oh my goodness.
Oh, yeah. I mean, these whales, they're huge, but they're also really rare. And boy, just to find one is an amazing thing. And I can't believe that we've actually worked on 3 blue whales in our career. That's over 25 years of doing skeletons like this. I never imagined that I'd get to do 1 blue whale, let alone 3. It's a lot of fun and it's a lot of hard work. So if a museum wanted 3, I would just, I'd have to.
We'd probably jump at the chance, but then we'd have to really think about how we would pull that off.
We need to hire a bunch of young biologists to help us.
But
That's what we need to do.
sometimes we do get to work on multiple skeletons for a single display, and that's always really fun because then we get to think about how they might interact together in nature, and we get to produce some kind of display that really speaks to that, and that's always really, really creative.
That's so true, Michi. One of my favorite displays is actually 3 dolphin skeletons, and it's because one dolphin is like jumping through the air and the other 2 are kind of swimming down beside each other, and it really shows like how those dolphins would have been in nature, because they never swim around all by themselves. They're always swimming in big groups of lots of dolphins together. So to have 3 of those skeletons together that's one of my favorite ones.
How did you end up doing this job?
I'll let you take that.
That's a really good question. Basically, when I was a kid, I was really curious about animals and how they worked. And my grandfather was a doctor, and I would bring home squirrels that I found dead at the side of the road, and I would dissect them and find out how they worked inside and that kind of thing. Then when I went to university, I got a biology degree, and one of my class projects was to put a skeleton together. And the next thing I knew, I got a job at a little museum, and here I am 25 years later, still putting skeletons together. So it was really just something that I never imagined that I'd grow up, and I still feel like I'm a little kid, but now I have my own little kids, but I get to go into my workshop and play with bones all the time. It's pretty fun.
What do your kids think about what you do?
I think when they stop to think about it, we've got 3, the older ones realize that it's kind of different and neat. As my eldest actually had some friends come over when she was about 8 years old, and her little girlfriend came into our living room and went, "Oh my gosh, what is that cool thing you've got hanging from your wall? Is that a bone or something?" And Mia says, "Oh, it's just a killer whale skull. My dad's got like 4 more in the garage. Let's go play Barbies."
What's your favorite skeleton?
Oh gosh, that's a really hard one to answer. I have so many that I love. I think we've done, about 25 or so whales.
Right.
I can think of, 8 or 10 that like really stand out for me, but
Choose one.
Okay. Often it's like the one that I'm working on right now, which is a 42-foot fin whale. So it's the second biggest whale that's ever lived on, in the oceans. And it's going to be going into the Sechelt First Nation Museum in Sechelt in the fall.
Thank you so much for talking to us today.
Thank you so much for having us. It was great to talk with you guys.
It was really nice to meet you all.
On our next episode, we will be talking about museums that are in houses.
Why would a museum be in a house?
Good question, Ava. Most of these types of museums are in houses where famous people lived.
You might have heard of the Anne Frank Museum. It's a museum in Amsterdam in a house where Anne Frank and her family hid from the Nazis during the Second World War.
Houses where famous musicians, artists, and writers have lived are often turned into museums. In France, one of the most famous house museums is the home of Claude Monet, who was a painter. Over 500,000 people visit his house and garden every year.
Green Gables is another example of a historic house that is in a museum. Anne of Green Gables was a character in a novel written by Lucy Maud Montgomery, so she never lived in a real house. However, her author did and based Green Gables on where she had grown up. People from all over the world visit Green Gables Heritage Place every year.
Different types of indigenous houses can be museums. In Hazelton, BC, the Kasan historic village and museum is built in longhouses. You can visit a longhouse as well as a pit house at the Squamish Lil Wat Museum.
The Louvre Museum was also a house. Well, okay, maybe not an ordinary house. Before it was turned into a museum, it was a palace where kings and queens lived.
On our next episode, we are going to be talking about the historic Joy Kagawa House in Vancouver. You will learn about Joy Kagawa, a famous Japanese-Canadian writer, see where she lived as a little girl, and learn about some Canadian history that we're not too proud of.
Thanks again to today's guests. Our music was written by Kevin MacLeod and is licensed under Creative Commons. For complete information, see our blog post at timetowonderpodcast.com.
For more information on this episode, visit timetowonderpodcast.com. A special thank you to our producer, Danny Rindeau. Thank you, Danny.
If you enjoy the podcast, please subscribe. Remember, next time you go to a museum, look, listen, and wonder.